Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
I want to start with probably the most important discussion happening in our country today, which is Sydney Sweeney.
Yeah.
So the Democrats have essentially been like, Sydney Sweeney represents like a Nazi white supremacy issue. Do you think it's that deep? And do you think attacking Sydney Sweeney is how they can win back young males?
Is that a good move? Yeah, my political advice to the Democrats is continue to tell everybody who thinks Sydney Sweeney is attractive is a Nazi. that appears to be their actual strategy. I mean, it actually reveals something pretty interesting about the Dems, though, which is that you have like a normal all-American beautiful girl doing like a normal jeans ad, right? They're trying to sell jeans to kids in America, and they have managed to so unhinge themselves over this thing. And it's like, you guys, did you learn nothing from the November 2024 election? Like, I actually thought that one of the lessons they might take is we're going to be less crazy. The lesson they have apparently taken is we're going to attack people as Nazis for thinking Sydney Sweeney is beautiful. Great strategy, guys. That's how you're going to win the midterms, especially young American men.
Their course correction lasted about 30 seconds.
That's right. Lasted 30 seconds. Somehow has gotten even crazier. But again, it's just so much of the Democrats is oriented around hostility to basic American life. So you have a pretty girl doing a jeans ad and they can't help but freak out. It reveals a lot more about them than it does us.
Vice President J.D. Vance is yucking it up on the Ruthless podcast about people on the left supposedly unhinging themselves, being crazy, and exercising hostility to basic American life due to the reaction of some to a recent advertisement for American Eagle starring Sydney Sweeney. As NPR reported in a piece titled The Ad Campaign That Launched 1,000 Critiques, Sydney Sweeney's Jeans, quote, the company's creative choices have prompted some to say the ad campaign promotes eugenics, a discredited scientific theory popular among white supremacists that the human race could be improved by breeding out less desirable traits. In this particular ad, Sweeney lays back with her head laying on a pillow while wearing an unbuttoned jean jacket and zipping up and buttoning her jeans.
Genes are passed down from parents to offspring, often determining traits like hair color, personality, and even eye color. My genes are blue.
Sydney Sweeney has her genes.
According to American Eagle, the purpose of the ad was to raise awareness about domestic violence. In fact, American Eagle planned to donate the money to a charity called Crisis Text Line. But given how Sweeney is presented in the ad, some have criticized it for sexualizing women. But it's the focus on genetics that led to the laughter of Vice President Vance in the clip that opened the show. And ironically, this isn't the only ad out right now discussing genetics. Dunkin' Donuts released an ad featuring the Summer I Turned Pretty actor Gavin Casalegno, who also references genetics.
Look, I didn't ask to be the king of summer. It just kind of happened. This tan? Genetics. I just got my color analysis back. Guess what? Golden summer. Literally. I can't help it. Every time I drink a Dunkin' Golden Hour refresher, it's like the sun just finds me. So if sipping these refreshers makes me the king of summer, guilty as charged. The Golden Hour Refresher, only at Dunkin'.
Referencing genetics, he says, I just got my color analysis back. And this ad was released just days after the American Eagle ad. Of course, there's a bit of a dad joke flair to it all, and you would imagine that these actors probably are not aware of some of the historical context for some of these conversations, so it can be easily passed off as harmless humor by those who made the ads. But these commercials aren't the first ones to utilize white actors referencing genes or genetics. In 1980, Calvin Klein featured the 15-year-old Brooke Shields pulling out her hair and stretching seductively on the floor, leading some to accuse the company of sexualizing a minor.
The secret of life lies hidden in the genetic code. Genes are fundamental in determining the characteristics of an individual and passing on these characteristics to succeeding generations. Occasionally, certain conditions produce a structural change in the gene, which will bring about the process of evolution. This may occur in one or more of the following ways. Firstly, by selective mating, in which a single gene type proves superior in transmitting its genes to future generations. Secondly, by gene drift, in which certain genes may fade away while other genes persist. And finally, by natural selection, which filters out those genes better equipped than others to endure in the environment. This may result in the origin of an entirely new species, which brings us to Calvin's and the survival of the fittest.
Calvin-Klein genes.
She talks about certain genes being superior. She mentions lesser equipped genes fading away, and she dreams about the possibility of an entirely new species and the survival of the fittest. So what do we make of all this? Given the rise of white supremacists during the second Trump administration, as well as the firing of non-white people throughout the government and nation in the name of fighting diversity, equity, and inclusion, should we be concerned about white actors discussing superior genes? Or is this much ado about nothing? Here to talk with me about this is Audrey Clare Farley. She is a writer, editor, and scholar of 20th century American culture. She earned a PhD in English literature at University of Maryland, College Park. She now teaches occasional classes at Mount St. Mary's University and for Narratively Academy. She's the author of 2 books, and she's just launched a Substack called May Beings, about spirits and other things that stir in the church and beyond. So I've been discussing these advertisements that feature attractive white actors talking about genetics, and Vice President J.D. Vance, of course, was making fun of some people on the left who respond by talking about eugenics. And so before we get into the specifics about eugenics, I saw this recent post on Threads by Benito Thompson, who said, "Those that don't know any history think everything is an overreaction right now, and those that do know history think everything is an underreaction right now." And so given the critique that those of us who bring this up are overreacting, I wonder if you have any thoughts on how knowing or not knowing history can affect the way we react to stories in the present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I largely agree with that quote. I think that if people are aloof about what eugenics is, then they're not likely to pick up on the subtext of that ad or the comments that were made by Vice President Vance. I'm on the side of thinking we should know more about history, and so I sympathize with that.
So with that in mind, what is eugenics and how did it form in the United States, possibly like in the years after the Civil War and some of the concerns that it was addressing?
Mm-hmm. The eugenics movement was a movement of the early 20th century to protect the purity of the white race. And the concerns about the deterioration of the national stock, as it was called, were spurred both by increased immigration from Asia and from Eastern European countries, as well as the movement of Black Americans from the South to northern cities. So suddenly these Eastern cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, they weren't looking the way that they used to, and there was concerns about the whiteness of the population degrading. And initially, actually, efforts to protect the race took the form of immigration restrictions, forced sterilization policies, laws that prohibited interracial marriage, and the sterilization focused on white people that were perceived to be defective. And that often trips people up because they think, well, if it targeted disabled white people or women who were perceived to be feeble-minded, how could it be racial? Well, it was racial in that those types of people were perceived as a threat to the strength and the vigor of the white race, women especially. Back then, to be feeble-minded was assumed that you were a flirt and that you were oversexed and therefore you might cross the color line. So they would be targeting women that we would call intellectually disabled today because they thought they might get with a Black man, have interracial babies. So even though there were a lot of white victims initially, it was still in the name of white supremacy.
Yeah. So as this mindset about race was brewing in the United States, how did it affect the shaping of our ideas about the American family? And then maybe from there, like what people considered to be the biblical family?
Right. So eugenics was largely a secular movement. It was popularized by scientists and other social authorities, even though it had some Christian backers from the beginning. What changed is that what's called negative eugenics, or targeting people who are perceived to be unfit, making sure that they don't reproduce, whether through forced sterilization or other means, that really fell out of fashion with World War II. So Americans began to see what was happening in Germany and in Europe and began to like bristle at the idea that people were being put in these state asylums in America and strapped to a table and deprived of their ability to reproduce. And so eugenics had to shapeshift. And the way that it shapeshifted is by shifting from negative eugenics to what's called positive eugenics, which is kind of a funny term. But positive eugenics is about getting the quote unquote right people to reproduce. So, white, middle class, able-bodied women, making sure that they marry, that they have what was called a sticky marriage, that they're connected to their spouse, and that they then have a lot of children. And the person who really shepherded this movement from negative to positive eugenics was a man named Paul Popenoe. He was one of the most prolific eugenics advocates in the United States. He gained the notice of Nazi Germany. And so, in order to rebrand, to modernize eugenics, he opened an institute called the American Institute of Family Relations, which dropped the sterilization piece and again focused on getting white, middle class, able bodied women to have lots of babies. And who came to work for him but James Dobson. James Dobson really cut his teeth at this institute and then went on to found Focused on the Family, which essentially baptized a lot of the material that he'd learned under Popenoe. So he's giving it a Christian veneer, such that this idea of getting married and having lots of children is the way that you express your faith as a good Christian, not so much as a good citizen, but as a Christian.
So as Dobson is kind of growing in this world, and you've got the rise of the moral majority and all that kind of stuff, like how are things like education and homeschooling or Christian schooling or even causes like evangelical adoption, do they fit into this?
hmm Yeah, I mean, it's harder to trace that connection, except that I think that homeschooling can be a way to really impart this very binaristic view of the world. This idea that some people are good and those kinds of people should proliferate and outbreed, quote unquote, them, which might not be racial others necessarily, but religious others or outsiders. And so often you do see with homeschooling families a lot of overlap with the quiverful movement, this idea that you should have a quiverful of children. But I do think that there often is overlap with these big Christian families that try to set themselves off from the secular world, and these eugenics mindsets. This idea that America is undergoing this kind of cultural degradation, and we need to reclaim it, make America the way that it used to be, which often means white Christian.
hmm So, like in the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, you had people like Ben Wattenberg talking about the birth dearth, where they were concerned about not enough white babies being born. And then now during the Trump administration, we've got JD Vance making derogatory comments about women in the workplace and calling for Americans to make more babies. He's even talked about like giving votes to families with more babies. And like I wonder maybe what are some of the echoes from our history that you're recognizing in some of these narratives today?
hmm Yeah, I think that it's very obvious that Vance wants to restore the whiteness of America, which is so interesting because he has a biracial family himself. What interests me about him specifically is that he's even tried to um, emphasize the theology of his nativism. So, as a Catholic, the concept of the common good is very important to Catholic social teaching. The idea that your behavior should be directed toward the ultimate end of, communal welfare. And he tried to make the case that actually nativism is good for the for all of us. And of course, he was rebuked first by Pope Francis and by Pope Leo for that. But it seems to me that he definitely is interested in restoring a white Christian America, both through immigration restrictions and also by limiting women's opportunities such that they're returned to the home and they become these homemakers and these mothers first and foremost. I also think about the way that some of these policies are playing out, even in like the Department of Transportation. Sean Duffy leads that. He's another Catholic. I think he has 9 children. And he floated the idea of directing transportation dollars towards communities where the birth rate is higher. There's definitely an investment on the Christian right to give public money toward the right kind of families, the right kind of people, in order to see them grow and to starve other groups of resources.
Yes. So how did you see some of this some of these impulses from Vance showing up in his critique of these commercials?
Yeah, I was surprised, first of all, by that commercial because it's hard to believe that the makers of the ad could not know how it was going to be received. My background is in literary studies, and so it reminded me of a famous quote by the philosopher Jacques Derrida that there's nothing outside the text, meaning the context always matters in deciphering the meaning of things. How could the makers of this ad possibly put that together in 2025 and not expect that people were going to read this subtext of here's this blonde, blue-eyed white woman who is said to have good genes? How were they not going to perceive something troubling about that message? That said, I don't think the left has had this really sensational response to it that Vance claims. I think progressives have bigger problems right now. A lot of people are focused on the genocide in Gaza and other events that I don't see people really pulling out their hair over this ad. And I don't believe anyone in public office has commented on it. I could be wrong about that, but I had read that there are no Democratic officials that have responded. So I think Vance wants it to be a bigger deal for the left than it is. But his comments are very interesting. He talks about Sydney Sweeney being an all-American beauty. Um, so here he is like criticizing progressives supposedly for reading Nazism into it. But he's suggesting that there's something all-American about her look, which is very eugenicist in its logic. And he's further said that Democrats haven't learned anything from the last election, that they want to attack tradition. So these words, all-American, tradition, being used to describe an attractive woman who's blonde and blue-eyed, it seems like he's not helping his case here.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's where it's hard for me to know how to handle something like this because, like, I think a lot of people on the left don't even know what eugenics is. And so there's
Right.
not this like outcry about it, like they're trying to make it out to be. And yet, like, you know, even if we disagree with Vance on the topic of eugenics, like is it possible for us to discuss these concerns without coming across to average Americans as if we're unhinged or demonstrating hostility to basic American life like Vance accuses us of? Because it seems to me like if any one of us even say a single word about it, you'll have the Vances of the world making it out like the entire Democratic Party has gone off the deep end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think no one is wrong for perceiving the subtext of that ad and being troubled by it. But again, to go back to that quote that you introduced, if people don't know the history and they don't have the knowledge to place that subtext, do they then think that we are unhinged? I don't know, but I tend to think that dialogue is good and educating people is good and pointing out that it's problematic to talk about the good genes of a blonde, blue-eyed woman in 2025 at a time when we are increasingly seeing this rhetoric about white replacement is wildly inappropriate.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the work you've done over the last few years, especially in bringing attention to some of this and for sharing some of that history with us today.
Thank you so much, Rick.
I realized that Sydney Sweeney, Gavin Casalegno, and Brooke Shields probably had no idea what their words in those commercials were communicating. Brooke Shields even said a few years after her commercial in the 1980s that she didn't even understand some of the sexual innuendo at the time. So I highly doubt she was knowledgeable about the history of eugenics, though I could be wrong on that. But as Farley said, dialogue is good, and educating people is good, and pointing out that it's problematic to talk about the good genes of a blonde, blue-eyed woman in 2025 at a time when we are increasingly seeing this rhetoric about white replacement is wildly inappropriate. Because imagine how that makes non-white people feel. Especially when they're watching TV and the images of these commercials are appearing alongside images of non-white people being dragged to places like Alligator Alcatraz. At some point, even if we're going to be cast as unhinged and hostile, we need to be able to have some dialogue about this. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.